There is an awful lot going on at the moment, and it needs cool heads and it needs cool decision makers. Unfortunately, at the moment we've got President Trump and President Putin, perhaps President Xi, who don't necessarily fit into that and don't give us confidence that we again come out with a just result and a just ceasefire anytime soon.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by former British Colonel and current military and security analyst, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, Hamish, it was only yesterday that we heard Trump saying that world leaders were dying to make a deal with him over tariffs, but now the president has announced a 90-day pause on the higher rate of reciprocal tariffs. On the one hand, we've got Trump's Homeland Security advisor saying that this was brilliant tactical planning, claiming that Trump has done something that's helped to reform the broken international trade in days, more than anyone has achieved in decades. On the other hand, people are saying that Trump has blinked first, and this is going to have a massive impact on his reputation. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I think these are really challenging times, and as we've discussed before, and as many people have discussed, Trump is dealing with world politics and strategic events and military operations and war in the same way that he would deal with buying a car or selling a house. Now, that is, I think Trump is now finding that just doesn't work. Ambiguity and confusion might well be a good way of doing a deal when you're trying to buy a new car or a new house, but actually, when you're trying to negotiate peace and sort conflict out, it's really, really challenging. And not really knowing what Trump is going to do at any one stage is not necessarily a good thing. In military operations, you ideally do lots of planning, you work out all the various things that go right and go wrong, and then you have a plan and you stick to it. If you keep changing your plan, it leads to confusion. And it generally does not work well. So I think, with Trump, you just, if he says something that the social media world doesn't agree with, he seems to change it 24 hours later. And as you said, some of his close supporters are saying his tariff challenge is just a brilliant operation. To most of the rest of the world, it seems like complete confusion. And I think another important point here is psychology. Psychology is so important in warfare. Great military philosophers always say psychology is 10 to 1 the physical. And when you look at what's been happening on these tariffs, for one, he doesn't appear to be putting any tariffs on Russia, which is all unexplainable. I can't believe what brilliant part of the plan that is. But also, it's by getting people, focused on purely this at the moment. We have a new Russian spring offensive in Ukraine. We have the Russians using industrial amounts of chemical weapons in Ukraine. It's just not hitting the news. Everybody's talking about how many points the FTSE's gone up and down, and how many percentage tariff China is charging US and the other way around. So this confusion, I think, when it comes to global peace and security, is not helping in any way.
We hear Trump, for example, he threatened a few weeks ago to put harsher sanctions onto Russia if they didn't comply. But now that Trump has done this, he's put this pause into effect with other tariffs. Is he effectively showing his cards too early? What sort of impression do you think that's going to give to Russia about Trump's negotiating ability and if he's actually going to stand his ground?
Well, I'm not an economist or financial expert. I only see sort of how the markets react, and I know that's all pretty short term, and what's going to happen in the long term. But if I put myself in the Kremlin, in Putin's seat, I'm pretty happy with what's going on at the moment, because Trump is splitting the world. A lot of people who expect his support, and a lot of people in the sort of the West coalition of the willing against the Russians are now really at financial loggerheads with the US. As such, that it's pretty much the European NATO countries who now see that they are really going to have to be serious about helping Ukraine out and opposing Russia, because Trump today might, tomorrow might not. So this confusion is really at the moment only helping one person, and that's Putin. And Putin thinks he's winning. And with all this confusion, and with Trump focused on his great deals, actually Putin is stepping up his efforts in Ukraine to try and get as much land as possible before any sort of peace deal or ceasefire negotiation happens, because it's not going to happen quickly without Trump and the power of the American military behind it. But Trump wants to deal in dollars at the moment, whereas Putin wants to deal in blood, and the two don't mix.
I mean, as you mentioned earlier, the subject of Ukraine has definitely taken a backseat in terms of reporting from the media, because tariffs have really dominated headlines the last few days. But what did you make of President Zelensky saying that his military had captured 2 Chinese soldiers in the battlefield?
Well, again, one has to be very careful not jumping to conclusions. And we know that North Korea, in effect, sold thousands of soldiers to Russia, and most of them have been killed or injured already. And the concern is, what did North Korea get in return? It's quite possibly that North Korea got Russian nuclear weapon know-how in return, and that is a huge concern. So when we know that Russia is desperate for soldiers for the front line, in fact, conscripts are paid way above the average wage in Russia. They are well-paid people, which is actually one of the reasons that the sort of mothers of Russia are not jumping up and down about all these casualties, because a lot of them see them as just mercenaries. But there appears to be a shortage of pure Russians who will take the money, as it were, to go to the front line, which is why Putin is having to go anywhere to find manpower. Now, 1 or 2 Chinese soldiers turning up is not remarkable. I understand Kyiv today are saying actually it's more like 150, 200. Now, that is more significant. I know that China has said that this is nothing to do with them, but when you've got 150 or so Chinese soldiers fighting, then that is that a coincidence or is that not? I don't know. But also we're aware there are a lot of Chinese components in Russian military equipment. And for a country that says it's completely neutral on this, that does not smack that way. And I think if we look back to the nuclear piece, the country that is building the most nuclear weapons at the moment is China. And of course, Chinese, no doubt, have got expertise, but not in the level of nuclear capability that they're trying to aspire to. So there is an awful lot going on at the moment, and it needs cool heads and it needs cool decision makers. Unfortunately, at the moment, we've got President Trump and President Putin, perhaps President Xi, who don't necessarily fit into that and don't give us confidence that we again come out with a just result and a just ceasefire anytime soon.
With those claims about the number of Chinese soldiers potentially being claimed will be in Ukraine, if that is verified and it is proven to be true, how do you expect Trump to react to this? We heard Zelensky make an appeal to the US, saying that America is clearly seeing the actions undertaken by Russia. And he said that he doesn't understand why America is not reacting forcefully towards Russia. How do you expect Trump to act on this?
Well, it will be interesting. A lot of a talk coming out of the White House is that Trump and his team see China as much more of a threat than Russia, and probably hence these tariffs. But again, they seem a bit illogical, because America buys so much more off China than China does of America. So, it would appear to be counterproductive. But it's very clear that Trump is trying to antagonize the Chinese, and Trump sees them more of a threat. But, I think he's rather ignoring the fact that they're probably all interlinked. Russia is closely linked to Iran and to North Korea and to probably China as well. So to ignore those three and to ignore Russia in particular, just to focus on China, seems to be, a very strange way of trying to de-escalate and create, peace in Europe and generally in the globe. So, not that I would know any better than Trump, but he seems to be blinded by the dollar and blinded by his apparent dislike of China and all that they do, whereas actually the root of all what's going wrong in the world at the moment is the Kremlin and Russia, their support to the Iranians, their support to North Korea, and no doubt their support to China as well. If Putin is put back in his box, as it were, that will de-escalate the world far more quickly than any sort of trade war I expect with China, which ultimately might well damage America more than it does China.
And it's interesting you say that. I spoke to David K. Johnston yesterday. He's an author and a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And he suggested an idea, this theory that I've heard from several people actually, about how Trump is aligned with this idea of a major global realignment where we see Russia, China, and the US as sort of the superpowers of the world. What do you make of that theory? I mean, looking at Trump's actions at the moment with his trade war on China, for example, I don't really see the evidence there of that working.
It is a strange thing. I mean, Trump has such an antipathy towards Europe that he seems to completely, blank them out, as were, and ignore them. But actually, of course, the European economy, if we, whether we include Britain in it or not, the European military and everything else is at least on a par with the US and China as well. So, he may well want to ignore Europe, but I think he does so at his peril. And, when you look at Russia, yeah, sure, Russia's got it's got nuclear weapons, but its army is being devastated. Its economy is tiny, much smaller than the UK's, for instance. So that doesn't really make any logic. But China, of course, they are the second economy in the world behind the US, and lots of experts seem to think that they will overtake the US in due course, which Trump is desperately trying to avoid. And of course, China is building up a significant military capability. But Trump is forgetting that when it comes to the nuclear issue, of course, America has vastly more nuclear weapons than China, a factor of 10 as to 1. So, there's a lot of that rhetoric around, but I'm not quite sure what coloured spectacles that Trump is looking through, but they're certainly not very clear ones.
If we look at more traditional allies of the US, I mean, if we look at the EU, for example, they've obviously come at loggerheads over these tariffs. And we have seen that since Trump paused these tariffs on the EU, Ursula von der Leyen has said that she wants to give negotiations a chance with the US. But I mean, if I think back to a few weeks ago when we had that Signal group chat leak, it really highlighted the anti-European sentiments and beliefs of a lot of the members of the Trump administration. I mean, where do you say we stand there at the moment between the US and the EU?
I think it is incredible. I've never claimed to understand the American people, but, I've traveled there quite a lot and worked there and worked with the US military quite a lot. And I'm well aware that most Americans don't have passports and most Americans don't travel and have a fairly America-centric view of the world. But one assumes that, the politicians and, the movers and shakers, don't fit into that sort of bracket and do have a worldly outlook. But some of the stuff that President Trump says and some of his close supporters, Hesketh and others and Vance, you would have thought they've never travelled outside the US and and don't have a world view because they're taking a very insular view. So I think that is a real concern. And when it comes to Europe itself, there is. I would have thought there was so much more that we have in common or should have in common with the US than we don't, more than anything else. I mean, most of the American people are of European stock. So it is quite bizarre that is the view that's taken. But having said all that, you've got to play the game in front of you. And, the world has got Trump for the next, 4 years. And we have got to try and learn to live with him and see what makes him tick and what doesn't. And at the moment, I think we're all still a bit confused.
A week is a long time in politics, but I feel like Trump's second administration, a day is a long time in politics, even hours.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think on Trump's first term in office, we got a bit of a feeling what he was going to be like. And, if there was any good about COVID, COVID did at least keep him under wraps because he couldn't have the malign influence that he is having in some areas now. So, as you say, yeah, a day is a long time in politics, not a week these days, and we've all got to learn to live with it. And the very fact is that Trump is the boss of the most powerful economy and most powerful military in the world, and unfortunately, at the moment, he doesn't seem to have any breaks or people around him who he will listen to give him really sound advice. And this firing off at the hip, again, it might very well be very well when you're doing a property deal, but when you're trying to save people's lives and enforce peace, it doesn't work. So yeah, I think we are where we are, and people have just got to react as best and quickly as they can to Trump, and hopefully Trump will realise that some of the decisions he makes and potentially makes could cause a lot of death and misery, and one would hope that is something that he morally would want to avoid.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens the next time we speak. Hamish, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.